I came home 3 hours early from a business trip, planning to surprise my wife with flowers and an apology for missing our anniversary dinner reservation. Instead, I stood frozen in my own hallway, listening to my wife scream at my 70-year-old mother in the kitchen my father built with his own hands, calling her a burden, a leech, an old woman who needed to learn her place in someone else's house. My mother wasn't arguing back. She was simply standing there, silent, absorbing every word, in the exact kitchen where she'd cooked family dinners for 30 years before I ever handed her a key to what she believed was still, in some small way, still partly her home. My wife didn't hear me come in. She didn't know I was standing right behind her until the moment I said her name, and everything about that marriage changed in the next 60 seconds. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about the people we trust with our families, and what happens when they reveal exactly who they really are. My name is Andrew Kessler, and this is the story of the afternoon I came home early, and a marriage I ended before I even finished setting down my suitcase. My mother, Patricia Kessler, raised my younger sister and me largely on her own after my father passed away from a heart attack when I was 19, a loss that hit our family hard, both emotionally and financially, since my father had been the primary earner throughout my parents' 22 years of marriage. My mother, who had worked part-time as a school librarian for most of that marriage, suddenly found herself needing to become the primary provider for a household still carrying a mortgage on the house my father had spent years slowly renovating himself, including a kitchen he'd rebuilt almost entirely with his own hands during a summer when I was 12, a kitchen my mother still cooked in every single day, filled with cabinets my father had personally sanded and stained. I want to give you some sense of the woman my mother is, because it matters enormously to understanding how genuinely shocking the scene I walked into eventually became. My mother is not a demanding person. She has never once, in my entire adult life, asked me for anything beyond ordinary visits and phone calls. She worked until she was 68, saved carefully, paid off that mortgage entirely on her own within 12 years of my father's death, and has lived, for the past several years since retiring, on a modest but sufficient combination of pension and Social Security income, fiercely independent in a way that occasionally frustrated me, since she rarely accepted help even when I genuinely wanted to offer it. About 2 years ago, my mother's health took a difficult turn, a diagnosis of moderate osteoarthritis in both knees that, combined with some early signs of heart trouble her doctor flagged during a routine checkup, made living entirely alone in that two-story house increasingly risky, particularly given the steep staircase my father had built decades earlier, long before either of them had considered what aging in that house might eventually require. I brought up, at the time, the possibility of my mother moving into an assisted living community, an option she rejected almost instantly and with more emotion than I'd expected, telling me she wasn't ready to leave the house my father had built, that it held too much of him in every wall and cabinet for her to simply walk away from it. What we eventually settled on, after several long conversations, was an arrangement where my mother would spend several days each week at my house, staying in a guest room my wife and I had set up specifically for her, particularly during periods when her arthritis flared badly enough that navigating her own staircase became genuinely dangerous, while maintaining her own home for the remainder of her time. With a part-time aide checking in during the days she stayed there alone. I met my wife, Danielle, about 6 years before this story takes place, at a mutual friend's wedding, and we married after a 2-year courtship that felt, at the time, genuinely happy and compatible. I want to be honest that in the early years of our marriage, Danielle's relationship with my mother had always carried a certain undercurrent of tension that I noticed but consistently minimized, telling myself it was simply the ordinary friction that exists between many wives and mothers-in-law, rather than something that required deeper examination. Danielle came from a background considerably more affluent than my own modest, working-class upbringing, and while she never said so explicitly, I sensed, over the years, a certain discomfort in her about my mother's more frugal habits, her insistence on driving an aging sedan rather than accepting help purchasing something newer, her habit of packing leftovers to bring home from family dinners, small, entirely ordinary behaviors that Danielle occasionally commented on with a thinly veiled note of embarrassment or irritation that I usually let slide rather than confronting directly. Once my mother began spending several days each week in our guest room, that underlying tension, which I had spent years quietly minimizing, began surfacing more frequently and more visibly. Danielle complained, periodically, about the guest room always smelling like eucalyptus, from the arthritis cream my mother used, about having to adjust our household routines around my mother's mealtimes and medication schedule, about feeling like she couldn't fully relax in her own home with another person present so consistently. I want to be honest about my own failures during this period, because I think acknowledging them matters to understanding how the situation was allowed to escalate as far as it eventually did. I heard these complaints from Danielle regularly, and rather than directly and firmly establishing that my mother's presence in our home was non-negotiable given her health needs, I found myself constantly trying to smooth things over, suggesting small adjustments, apologizing on my mother's behalf for inconveniences that, looking back, were never actually significant inconveniences at all, simply the ordinary presence of an aging woman who needed somewhere safer to be during her worst flare. The specific incident I'm about to describe happened on a Thursday afternoon, during a week when I was scheduled to be traveling for a 3-day business conference in another state. My mother was staying at our house that particular week, since her arthritis had been flaring badly enough that her aide had recommended she avoid her own staircase entirely for at least several days. Ups. I had spoken with my mother by phone the night before, and everything had sounded entirely ordinary, no indication whatsoever of any building tension in the household. My conference wrapped up considerably earlier than scheduled, due to a keynote speaker canceling and the organizers deciding to condense the final day's agenda rather than fill the remaining time with less essential programming. Rather than staying an extra night in a hotel as originally planned, I decided to catch an earlier flight home, wanting to surprise Danielle, since I'd missed our 6th wedding anniversary just 2 days earlier due to travel and had been feeling genuinely guilty about it. I picked up a bouquet of flowers at the airport, planning a quiet, apologetic evening making up for the missed celebration. I let myself into the house quietly around 4 in the afternoon, expecting an empty house, since Danielle's work schedule typically kept her out until at least 5:30. Instead, as I set my suitcase down in the front hallway, I heard voices coming from the kitchen, Danielle's voice, unmistakably, raised in a tone I had genuinely never heard her use before, not in 6 years of marriage, not during even our most heated disagreements. I want to describe walking down that hallway toward the kitchen carefully, because every step of that short distance is burned into my memory with unusual clarity. I could hear Danielle's voice getting clearer as I approached, and what I heard stopped me completely, just outside the kitchen doorway, still hidden from view, holding a bouquet of flowers that suddenly felt absurdly inadequate for whatever was actually happening in my own home. Danielle was saying, in a voice sharp with a contempt I had never once witnessed her direct at anyone, that my mother needed to understand that this was not her house, that she couldn't simply leave her old lady smells, and her cheap grocery store leftovers, cluttering up spaces that Danielle had worked hard to keep presentable. She said, and I remember this sentence with a clarity that still makes my stomach turn, that my mother was, in her exact words, a burden that Andrew is too weak to actually deal with, and that she was sick and tired of playing nursemaid to someone else's aging mother in her own kitchen. I stood frozen in that hallway, listening to my wife tear into my 70-year-old mother with a cruelty I genuinely could not reconcile with the woman I had married 6 years earlier. I could hear my mother's voice too, quiet, almost inaudible compared to Danielle's, offering small, defensive murmurs, apologizing for a spilled bit of tea on the counter that had apparently, I later learned, triggered this entire eruption, saying she would clean it up immediately, that she was sorry, that she didn't mean to be any trouble. I want to emphasize something about my mother's response in that moment, because it revealed to me, with painful clarity, exactly how long this dynamic must have been quietly building without my knowledge. My mother wasn't arguing back. She wasn't defending herself, wasn't pushing back against any of the cruel characterizations Danielle was throwing at her. She was simply absorbing it, quietly, apologetically, the way someone absorbs an attack they've clearly experienced before and learned, through repetition, that resistance only seemed to make worse. I stepped into that kitchen doorway, and I want to describe the scene exactly as I found it. My mother was standing near the counter, a dish towel in her hands, a small spill of tea visible on the countertop behind her, her posture curled slightly inward in a way that made her look smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, even during the difficult months immediately following my father's death. Danielle stood a few feet away, her face flushed with anger, mid-sentence, apparently building towards some further escalation that I never got to hear, because the moment I said her name, everything in that kitchen went immediately silent. Danielle turned toward me, and I watched her face go through an almost instantaneous transformation, from open, unrestrained anger to a kind of frozen, horrified realization, as she processed, in real time, exactly how much of that conversation I must have overheard standing in that hallway. She started to say something, some immediate attempt at explanation or justification, but I held up my hand, and something in my expression apparently communicated clearly enough that she needed to stop talking, because she did, immediately, standing there in silence while I crossed the kitchen to my mother's side. I asked my mother, gently, if she was okay, and watched her nod, though her eyes were wet in a way that told me the honest answer was considerably more complicated than a simple nod could convey. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage given what I was feeling internally, how long this had been happening, whether this was the first time Danielle had spoken to her this way. My mother hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and her lifelong instinct to avoid causing conflict within her son's household, before finally, quietly, admitting that this wasn't the first time, that it had been happening, in smaller and larger forms, for several months, always during periods when I was traveling or otherwise not present in the house to witness it directly. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, standing in my father's kitchen, holding a bouquet of flowers meant for an apologetic anniversary dinner, learning that my wife had spent months quietly humiliating my mother whenever she believed no one important would ever find out. It wasn't simple anger, though anger was certainly present. It was something closer to a complete, disorienting collapse of trust, the specific, sickening realization that the person I had built a shared life with for 6 years had a version of herself she deliberately hid from me, a version considerably crueler and more contemptuous than anything I had ever witnessed directly. I turned to Danielle and asked her directly whether what my mother had just told me was true, whether this had been happening repeatedly, over months, specifically during times when I wasn't present to see it. Danielle's response, in that moment, revealed almost as much as the original incident itself. Rather than immediate, genuine remorse, her first instinct was to attempt to justify the pattern, saying that she had tried to bring up these frustrations with me before, that I had never taken her concerns seriously, and that she had finally reached a breaking point that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with legitimate grievances I had apparently failed to adequately address. I want to acknowledge, honestly, that there was a kernel of legitimate truth buried within Danielle's defense, one I've had considerable time to reflect on since that afternoon. I had, in fact, minimized and smoothed over her complaints about my mother's presence in our home for months, rather than directly and firmly establishing boundaries around how my mother deserved to be treated regardless of any adjustment inconveniences her presence created. That failure was genuinely mine, and I've taken real accountability for it in the time since. But that acknowledgement, then and now, does absolutely nothing to excuse or justify the specific, deliberate cruelty I had just witnessed directed at a 70-year-old woman quietly cleaning up a spilled cup of tea in the kitchen her late husband had built with his own hands. I told Danielle, standing in that kitchen, that regardless of whatever legitimate frustrations she felt about the living arrangement, there was no version of those frustrations that justified speaking to my mother the way I had just heard her speak, calling her a burden, mocking her modest habits, treating a genuinely kind, unassuming woman with a level of contempt I still find difficult to fully process even now. Months later, I told her that I needed her to pack a bag and stay somewhere else that night, that I couldn't have her in the same house as my mother after what I just witnessed, and that we would need to have a much longer, more serious conversation once I'd had time to process everything, but that this specific evening was not the time or place for that conversation to happen with any productivity. Danielle's reaction to this request escalated quickly into a mixture of anger and genuine panic, alternating between demanding that I was overreacting to one bad moment taken out of context, and pleading, more desperately, that I not make any hasty decisions about our marriage based on a single afternoon. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that this clearly hadn't been a single afternoon, based on what my mother had just told me, and that the pattern itself, sustained over months and deliberately hidden from me, mattered considerably more than whatever explanation she wanted to offer for this particular instance. I want to be honest that Danielle did leave the house that evening, staying with her sister for what initially was intended to be simply that one night, but that stretched, over the following weeks, into a considerably longer separation as we both grappled with what this incident had actually revealed about the health and honesty of our entire marriage. I spent that first evening focused entirely on my mother, making sure she was genuinely okay, sitting with her in the living room long after the flowers I'd brought home sat forgotten and wilting on the kitchen counter. I asked her, gently and repeatedly, why she had never told me any of this was happening, and her answer, delivered with the same quiet humility that had defined her entire adult life since my father's death, was one I've thought about constantly in the months since. She told me she hadn't wanted to be the reason my marriage fell apart, that she'd rather absorb some difficult moments quietly than risk creating conflict between me and my wife, a sacrifice she'd apparently been willing to make silently, for months, specifically because she loved me enough not to want to become a source of tension in my own household. I told my mother that night, as directly and sincerely as I knew how, that her comfort and dignity in my own home would never again be something she needed to quietly sacrifice for the sake of anyone else's convenience, including, if necessary, my marriage itself. I told her that I was deeply sorry it had taken an early flight home and an overheard conversation for me to finally understand exactly what had been happening whenever I wasn't there to witness it directly, and that this failure of attentiveness was genuinely mine to own, regardless of whatever else happened between Danielle and me going forward. The following weeks involved a series of difficult conversations between Danielle and me, first through a couples counselor we both agreed to see, attempting to understand not just the specific incident I'd witnessed, but the deeper pattern of resentment and dishonesty that had allowed months of hidden cruelty to build without my knowledge. I want to note, in fairness, that Danielle did eventually express what felt like genuine remorse during several of these sessions, acknowledging that regardless of any legitimate frustrations about our living arrangement, the way she had spoken to my mother, repeatedly, over months, represented a genuine failure of character that she needed to take real responsibility for, rather than simply attributing to unaddressed marital tension. But I also came to understand, through those same counseling sessions, something about Danielle that I don't think I had fully allowed myself to see clearly during our 6 years together, a certain deep-seated belief, one she eventually admitted to somewhat directly, that difficult or inconvenient family members, whether aging parents or otherwise, existed as problems to be managed and minimized rather than people deserving of patience and genuine compassion regardless of how inconvenient their needs occasionally became. That belief, once I saw it clearly, revealed by that kitchen incident and confirmed through the honest conversations that followed, felt fundamentally incompatible with the kind of family life I wanted to build, one where my mother, and eventually, I hoped, my own children someday, would never have to quietly absorb cruelty simply to keep domestic peace with someone who found their presence inconvenient. Danielle and I separated formally about 4 months after that afternoon in the kitchen, and our divorce was finalized just under a year later. I want to be honest that this decision was genuinely difficult, that 6 years of marriage don't simply dissolve without real grief and real uncertainty about whether I was making the right choice. But I also want to be honest that I have never once, in the time since, regretted the decision I made standing in that kitchen doorway, choosing my mother's dignity over the comfortable continuation of a marriage that had apparently been hiding a considerably crueler undercurrent than I had ever allowed myself to fully see. My mother moved permanently into the guest room of my house shortly after the divorce was finalized, an arrangement that, freed from the tension and resentment that had apparently been building silently for months, has become one of the genuine joys of my daily life rather than a source of hidden conflict. We share dinners together most nights now, no undercurrent of contempt, no quiet cruelty hidden behind a closed kitchen door whenever I happen to be traveling. She's taught me several of my father's favorite recipes over the past year, recipes I never fully appreciated learning as a teenager but that now feel like genuinely important connections to both of my parents, cooked together in a kitchen my father built and that my mother, finally, gets to occupy without fear of judgment or hidden resentment from anyone sharing that space with her. I think about that afternoon often, the flowers I never got to give, the anniversary dinner that never happened, the specific sound of my wife's voice describing my mother as a burden in a kitchen my father built with his own 2 hands. I think, most of all, about how close that entire situation came to continuing indefinitely, hidden and unaddressed, simply because my conference happened to end a few hours early, and because I happened to walk quietly enough down that hallway to hear the truth before Danielle had any chance to compose a more palatable version of it for my benefit. I've learned, in the time since, to ask more direct, specific questions about how my mother is actually treated during the times I'm not present to witness it myself, rather than simply assuming that ordinary domestic peace in my absence reflects genuine kindness rather than carefully managed appearances. I've learned that the people who love us most quietly, who absorb difficulty without complaint specifically because they don't want to become a burden on our own relationships, deserve far more active protection than simple trust that everything is fine whenever we happen not to be looking directly at it.